I'd like to talk a little bit about charting sprung patterns. And if you're familiar at all with weaving or with knitting, you know that it can be very helpful to show in a graphical representation what your cloth is going to come out like. This would be in a weaving draft with a drawdown chart or a lace pattern chart, also a chart for cabled knitting that can show the slants of the stitches as well as the pattern of holes. A weaving chart would show the play of color or the thread structure. And in the structure of sprung, there are a number of different things that you can do. You can change the angle of the twist. So instead of a Z twist, you can have an S twist. You can have more than one twist in a row, which changes the height of the row. Those things would be a little bit more difficult to chart. What I'd like to talk about is charting holes that are created as slits where you push down multiple threads and pick up multiple threads to create this pattern. I hope that you've seen my video on creating this particular pattern. It's called the clover pattern. This video will make more sense if you go and watch that one. So, I have discovered 4 different ways to chart. The first one was in a book by this author. I believe you pronounce that Astrid Sandvold, and this is the title of the book. It was published in 1927. On page 10, she has a layout of a pattern of holes. Part of it looks like this, and part of it looks like this. I believe this represents the clover pattern. This would represent holes that, instead of going over 2 rows, are actually double the height and would go over 4 rows. And this is how she represents that on graph paper. I wasn't sure that you'd be able to see that, so I enlarged it, and this would be 1 square on the graph paper. And you can see the first hole, so it's right here. The second bunch of holes are there. Each of the squares represents 4 rows. And it'll go row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, and so on. This whole pattern would take up 8 rows. And this means that Astrid Sandvold is showing both the plate and overplate rows in her graph. This would be the holes that are double the height. And that's how she represents those. Let's move on to the next one. In the book, The Family Creative Workshop, Volume 17, published in 1976, there was an article by Glenda Stoller called Sprung Twisting Threads. And this is on page 2173. Here is your clover. Instead of circles, there are squares. They are just inside the square of the graph paper, and the overplate row is not depicted. So each square jumps from row 1 to row 3 to row 5. And if you've knitted lace before, you may know that in knitted lace pattern graphs, only 1 row will be shown, and when you turn around your knitting and you knit back and there's no pattern in that particular row, that's not given in the chart. So this is similar what Glenda Stoller has done. And we'll find that Peter Collingwood as well ditched the overplate row, and so his goes row 1, row 3, row 5. This is Peter Collingwood's The Techniques of Sprung, published in 1974. His method for charting is on pages 150 and 151. And I've taken his system and created a clover. Glenda Stoller didn't show a clover either. I had to extrapolate from what she had. And we have dots to show normal sprung plate and overplate rows. In this row you start to make the hole, and he represents that with a vertical line. And he says that each square actually represents a back thread and a front thread. So we have back thread, front thread, back thread, front thread, back thread, front thread. This whole clover is over 6 warp threads. The squares right around the holes don't have that dot because they lend threads to the hole, and that's why he's depicted it this way. The nice thing about his method is that you should be able to look at a photograph, chart out the pattern of holes, and then figure out how many warp threads you need. He says the calculation for figuring out your total warp threads, where x is the squares, is x, the number of squares, times 2, and then add 2, and that is because at the beginning and end of the plate row you're going to need those 2 extra strands in order to be able to do it. He does show holes that run double the height, and so this is how he shows that. At this point in his figures, he stopped doing the dots. I guess he didn't feel they were needed. Okay, let's move on to the last one. This is the author. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that because I'm afraid I would get it wrong. I don't even want to try to pronounce that either. She was in Holland. She wrote this book, and it was published in 1921. It was published again in 1925, and there were more pages. The chart system only is in the book from 1925. It's on page 32. And here is your clover. And you can see that she has also ditched the overplate rows. It goes row 1, row 2, row 1, row 3, row 5. You'll see that it's stretched out horizontally compared to the others. She has diagonal lines, and they're on the chart. Again, I've had to extrapolate the clover from what she had, but she had a key to the chart, and these are what the symbols mean. I translated the words using an online translator, and this is what it came up as. Puncture for the filled-in square, which you would think is a hole. The slanting line is straight stitch, and she actually did refer to making sprang as stitching, straight stitches. This line here, the vertical line, translate as stick or wand or switch. So it's a description of what it looks like. I'm not sure that's a description of what it looks like in the sprung. An open square is not braided. She had holes that were 4 times the height. And she had them right next to each other, and that's where the stick was. And if you look at sprung, what happens to the threads there is quite interesting. So I hope you'll play around with that and figure out why she had that. She doesn't give it in the clover. I would think that it should be right there, but it's not. Alright, well that, I hope, is an accurate summation of the 4 different ways I've found for charting holes in sprung. One last thing I would add is that because this line is slanted and it does show a Z twist, it might be possible to show a different angle of twist, the line going the other way. That it is a possibility, because it is difficult to show in graphical representation without actually drawing a schematic of the threads, patterns where you switch back and forth between S twist and Z twist.